My name is Victoria Lane. I am 30 years old. I was standing in the small kitchen of my adobe house on the outskirts of Sedona, Arizona, sorting through a stack of old client files for a freelance design project when I yanked open the bottom drawer of my desk and found that forgotten manila envelope shoved way in the back. It had been there since last winter, crumpled and slightly torn at one corner. Inside were a handful of photos from our annual family gathering at the rented cabin in the Red Rocks, plus one folded piece of notebook paper in my father's neat handwriting. I spread everything out on the counter under the afternoon light coming through the window, and my chest went tight. In the big group photo they always took on the back deck at sunset, I was missing, not blurry in the background or half out of frame, just gone, cropped clean like I had never stood there with everyone else. The note said something about keeping the week focused and peaceful and not letting old patterns ruin the time together. I stood there staring at it for a long time, the red rocks outside turning gold in the late light, while the whole chaotic mess of that week came rushing back in pieces I had tried to shove down. If you have ever opened something ordinary and had your entire understanding of your family shift in one breath, you will understand why I am telling this story. It still sits heavy some days, but it also set me free in ways I never expected. That gathering was supposed to be the same tradition we had done for years. We rented a big cabin with enough bedrooms for all of us, hiked the trails around Sedona, cooked too much food, and tried to catch up on life. My mother, Eleanor, had been the one who kept the tradition alive after my grandmother passed. My father, Philip, usually went along with whatever plans she made. My older brother, Nathan, had started taking more of a lead in recent years, saying someone needed to keep things organized. I had driven up from my place in Sedona the same afternoon as everyone else, windows down, music loud, telling myself this year would feel different. I was wrong. We arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The place sat on a quiet road with views of the red Buttes pine trees all around and a big wooden deck that wrapped around two sides. My mother was already unpacking groceries in the kitchen when I walked in with my bag. She gave me a quick hug and said she was glad I made it before dark. My father was on the couch with his laptop open, barely looking up. Nathan was standing at the big wooden table in the main room, spreading out a printed itinerary like he was running a corporate retreat. He looked up when I came in and gave me that tight smile he had been using more and more. Victoria, good. We were just going over the schedule, he said. I put together a few things so we are not just wandering around all week. I set my bag down and walked over. The itinerary had hiking times, meal plans, and one block labeled Family Planning Discussion, Tuesday evening. I did not see my name on any of the activity leads. I did not know we were doing a formal planning session. I said, keeping my voice light, "What are we planning?" Nathan did not look up from the paper. Mom's next procedure and how we are going to handle the follow-up care and the cabin schedule for next year. We already talked through the basics on the drive up. Figured it would be smoother if a couple of us handled the details first. My mother glanced at me from the kitchen but did not say anything. My father closed his laptop and stood up, stretching his back. Your brother has a good head for this kind of thing, he said. We do not need to turn every conversation into a big production. The words landed harder than I expected. I had driven up the same road they had. I had the same last name. Yet somehow the three of them had already discussed something important about our mother's health without me. I felt the first flicker of that old familiar heat in my chest, the one that always came when I realized I had been left out of something that mattered. I tried to keep it small. I would have liked to be part of that conversation, especially since it is about Mom. Nathan finally looked at me. His expression was calm, almost patient, the way someone looks at a child who does not understand the rules yet. Victoria, you know how these things go with you. You get worked up, everything turns into a debate, and then nobody gets anything decided. We were trying to keep it simple this year, for Mom's sake. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. My mother turned back to the groceries without commenting. My father walked over to the fireplace and started stacking wood like the conversation was already finished. I stood there holding the edge of the table, trying to decide whether to push or let it go. I pushed. That is not fair. I can handle a conversation about Mom's health without turning it into a circus. I am the one who drove her to 2 of her appointments last month. Nathan's jaw tightened. He folded the itinerary and slid it into a folder. See, this is exactly what I am talking about. You make everything about how you are being treated instead of what actually needs to get done. Mom does not need the extra stress right now. The words came out smooth and practiced like he had said some version of them before. My father nodded once almost absently and kept stacking wood. My mother stayed quiet at the counter. The only sound for a moment was the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the low hum of the refrigerator. I felt something shift in the room like the air had gotten thinner. This was not just Nathan being controlling. This was all three of them agreeing, without saying it out loud, that I was the problem they needed to manage. I picked up my bag and carried it to the bedroom at the far end of the cabin, the one I always took because it had the best morning light. I closed the door harder than I meant to. The sound echoed down the hallway. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the pine walls until my breathing slowed. Outside, I could hear Nathan and my father talking in low voices on the deck. I could not make out the words, but the tone was easy, almost relieved, like they had handled something difficult and could now move on. That was the first night. The rest of the week did not get calmer. It got louder and more unpredictable in ways I still have trouble describing without my hands starting to shake. The next morning, Nathan announced at breakfast that he and my father were taking the main trail up to the overlook, and that my mother was staying behind to rest. He did not ask if I wanted to come. He just said the hike was probably too much, and that I could help Mom with lunch instead. I told him I had hiked that trail plenty of times and would rather go. He looked at my father, who shrugged and said, "Whatever keeps the peace, son." I went on the hike anyway, walking fast ahead of them until I reached the overlook by myself. The view was the same breathtaking sweep of red rock and sky it had always been, but it did not feel like mine anymore. When they caught up, Nathan made a joke about me, always needing to be first. My father laughed. I did not. By Tuesday, the tension had settled into something heavier. We were supposed to have the family planning discussion after dinner. I spent most of the day outside on the deck with my sketchbook trying to stay out of the way. Aunt Clara Voss, my mother's older sister, had driven up from Flagstaff that morning. She was the one person in the family who had never treated me like I was too much. She sat with me for a while, both of us watching the light move across the rocks, and she asked how work was going. I told her it was fine. She did not push. At dinner, Nathan took the head of the table without anyone suggesting it. He steered the conversation straight into the planning discussion like it was the most natural thing in the world. He talked about schedules for my mother's recovery, who would drive her to appointments, how the cabin rental should be split next year. Every time I tried to add something, he talked over me or changed the subject. When I finally said loud enough for everyone to hear that I wanted to be part of the decision about who would stay with Mom the first week after her procedure, Nathan set his fork down and looked at me across the table. "Victoria, we already decided that part on the drive up. You were not there. We cannot keep rehashing everything because you feel left out." The words landed like a slap. My mother looked down at her plate. My father reached for the salt like he had not heard anything unusual. Aunt Clara set her water glass down slowly and stared at Nathan. The room went very quiet for a second. Then everything started moving at once. I stood up so fast my chair scraped hard against the wood floor. "You decided without me about Mom, and you are acting like that is normal." Nathan's voice rose to match mine. "Because every time we include you, it turns into this. You cannot just let things be simple. You have to make it a fight." My father finally spoke, his voice tired and flat. "Nathan is right. You turn everything into a scene, Victoria. We are trying to take care of your mother here." The words kept coming, overlapping, getting louder. Aunt Clara tried to say something about everyone calming down. Nathan talked over her. My mother started crying quietly at the end of the table. I remember the sound of my own voice cracking when I asked my father how long he had been agreeing with Nathan that I was the one causing problems. He did not answer. He just looked at Nathan like he was waiting for the next instruction. I walked out onto the deck and stood at the railing with my back to the cabin. The night air was cold and smelled like pine and dust. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the wood to steady them. Behind me, the voices kept going, rising and falling in bursts. At one point, I heard Nathan say something about protecting the family from unnecessary drama. I did not turn around. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps on the gravel path that ran between the cabins. An older man from the cabin 2 doors down was walking his dog. He nodded at me the way neighbors do when they have seen you around a few times. "Sounded pretty intense in there," he said, not unkindly. "Your family seems to have figured out how to keep things running smooth this year. Last time I saw you all, it was a lot more lively." He kept walking. The comment was small, almost nothing, but it hit me harder than anything Nathan had said at the table. Even the neighbors had noticed. They had a version of us now where I was the extra noise that had been removed so the rest of the family could function. I stayed on the deck until the voices inside finally dropped. When I went back in, the dishes had been cleared and everyone had scattered to their rooms. Aunt Clara was still at the table folding napkins that did not need folding. She looked up when I came in. "Sit with me a minute," she said quietly. I did. She did not try to defend Nathan or my father. She just sat there with me in the quiet until the cabin settled for the night. Before I went to my room, she squeezed my hand once and said, "Some things are not worth losing yourself to fix." I did not sleep much. The next morning, I packed my bag while everyone else was still in their rooms. I left a note on the kitchen counter saying I had work to get back to in Sedona. Nobody came out to stop me. I drove down the winding road with the windows up and the radio off the red rocks blurring past until I hit the highway. That was months ago. The envelope with the cropped photo and my father's note stayed in the drawer until today. I had not wanted to look at it. Now that I have, I keep thinking about how easily they rewrote me out of the picture and how long I let them. I got back to my house in Sedona that same night and tried to tell myself the cabin had just been one more family visit that had spiraled for reasons I could not control. The red rocks outside my window looked the same as they always did, but nothing else felt familiar. My older brother Nathan had already sent 3 texts before I even unlocked my front door. The first one said I had overreacted and embarrassed everyone. The second said the family needed space to focus on my mother without my constant need to make everything about you. The third one was shorter. It just said, "Dad agrees. Let it go for once." I sat on my couch with the phone in my lap and read them again. The words were so calm, so neatly typed, like he was explaining something obvious to a difficult child. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Nothing I could say would change the version of me he had already written into the story. My father had not texted at all. My mother sent one short message the next morning that said she hoped I had made it home safely and that she would call when things settled. She never did call that week. The days after the cabin turned into a strange kind of quiet war. Nathan started a group text about my mother's upcoming procedure and listed who would handle which appointments. My name was not on the list. When I asked in the thread why I had been left off, he replied in the group that some people were better at handling logistics and others were better at emotional support from a distance. My father liked the message. My mother did not respond. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. This was not just one bad week. This was my older brother deciding with my father's quiet permission that I no longer belonged in the practical parts of our family. I tried to keep living my normal life in Sedona. I had client deadlines and hikes I usually loved, but everything felt off balance. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor from 2 houses down while I was getting coffee. She asked how the family trip had gone. I said it had been fine. She gave me a careful look and said, "That's good. Last year when I saw you all at the market, you seemed so close. This time your brother mentioned you had to leave early for work. He said it was probably for the best because things were getting tense. She smiled like she was being kind. The comment landed like a small stone in my stomach. Even people outside the family were hearing the cleaned up version where I was the one who could not handle being there. I started seeing Dr. Elena Vargas twice a month after that. She had an office in a little adobe building near the Arts District in Sedona with big windows that looked out at the rocks. She was the first person I had ever told the full story to without trying to soften it. She listened without interrupting while I described the itinerary on the table, the way my older brother had spoken over me at dinner, the way my father had nodded like it was reasonable. When I finished, she asked one quiet question. What would it mean if this pattern did not start at the cabin but had been building for years? I did not have an answer ready. The question sat with me for days. The texts from my older brother kept coming, each one a little sharper. One night, he called instead of texting. I almost did not answer, but something in me needed to hear his voice say it out loud. I put the phone on speaker and sat at my kitchen table with the lights low. "You cannot keep doing this, Victoria," he said before I could even say hello. His voice was tight and controlled, the same tone he had used at the cabin. "Every time the family tries to handle something important, you turn it into a crisis. Dad and I are trying to make decisions that actually help Mom. You showing up and demanding to be included just makes it harder for everyone." I kept my own voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. "I am not demanding anything. I am her daughter. I have been driving her to appointments and sitting with her during the hard days. Why am I suddenly the one who cannot be trusted with information?" "Because you make it about yourself," he said, and the words came faster now. "You always have. You cannot just support quietly. You have to be the loudest voice in the room. That is why we planned without you. It was easier. Mom does not need the extra stress of watching you spiral every time someone makes a decision without running it by you first." I heard my father's voice in the background, low and tired. "Nathan is right, Victoria. We are trying to keep things stable. You have always been the one who makes everything harder than it needs to be." The line went quiet for a second. I could hear the faint sound of the television in their house. My older brother had called from my father's living room with my father sitting right there agreeing. The realization hit me like cold water. This was not Nathan acting alone. This was both of them choosing again and again to write me out of the parts of our family that mattered. I ended the call without saying goodbye. My hands were still shaking when I set the phone down. I sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the road outside. Something inside me had shifted. I was no longer trying to figure out how to fix the relationship. I was starting to understand that they had already decided the relationship did not include me the way I had always assumed it did. Aunt Clara called 2 days later. She had stayed at the cabin for a few more days after I left, helping my mother rest and keeping an eye on things. Her voice on the phone was careful but steady. "I need to tell you something," she said. "After you left, your brother and your father had a conversation on the deck. I was in the kitchen with the window open. I recorded part of it on my phone because I was worried about what I was hearing. I did not know if I should show you, but I think you need to hear it." She sent the file that night. I sat on my couch with the lights off and played it. The recording was a little muffled from the distance, but the voices were clear enough. My older brother's voice came first. "She will get over it," he said. "She always does. The important thing is that we can actually make decisions without her turning everything into a fight. Dad, you know I am right. She is too emotional for this stuff. We cannot keep pretending she can handle the real decisions." My father's voice answered slower and quieter. "I know. It is easier this way. Your mother does not need the drama. You handle it. I will back you up." The recording ended there. I played it 3 more times. Each time the words landed the same way. My older brother had not just excluded me from one conversation. He had convinced my father that I was a problem that needed managing, and my father had agreed without hesitation. The carefully built story they told everyone else, the one where Nathan was the steady, responsible son, and I was the unpredictable daughter had been spoken out loud in their own voices. I did not sleep that night. I kept seeing the cropped photo from the envelope and hearing the recording at the same time. The family myth they had built was not an accident. It was a choice they made every time they decided my voice did not belong in the room. Aunt Clara had stayed quiet for years because she did not want to make things worse. Now she had given me the one thing I had never had before proof that was not just my memory or my feelings. The next morning I drove into town and sat in Dr. Elena Vargas's office with the recording on my phone. I played it for her without explaining first. When it finished, she looked at me for a long moment. "What do you want to do with this?" she asked. I did not have a clear answer yet. Part of me wanted to send it to every relative we had. Part of me wanted to delete it and pretend I had never heard it. The truth sat somewhere in between. I was not ready to burn everything down, but I was done pretending the fire had not already started. That same afternoon, my older brother texted again. This time he said the family was having another planning call that evening, and that it would be better if I did not join because things are still too raw. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention the recording. He simply assumed I would stay in the place he had assigned me. I did not reply. Instead, I called Aunt Clara back and asked her one question. "If I decide I cannot keep showing up for people who have already decided I do not belong, will you still be there?" She answered without hesitation. "I already am." I hung up and sat on my back porch watching the light fade on the red rocks. For the first time in months, the shaking in my hands had stopped. I did not know yet what the next step would look like, but I knew I was no longer willing to be the person they needed me to be, so they could keep their story comfortable. The recording changed something fundamental in me. I stopped waiting for my older brother or my father to suddenly remember that I belonged in the room. Instead, I started asking myself what I was willing to keep carrying and what I was finally ready to set down. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. I hiked the trails near my house in Sedona. I met with Dr. Elena Vargas and talked through what it meant to stop performing the role they had written for me. But underneath that quiet, something was building. Aunt Clara stayed in touch almost every day. She did not push me to do anything dramatic. She just kept reminding me that I did not have to keep showing up for people who had already decided my voice was a problem. The breaking point came 3 weeks later during a family call about my mother's procedure. My older brother had scheduled it without asking me, and then sent a calendar invite like it was a business meeting. I almost declined. Then I remembered the recording sitting on my phone and the way my father's voice had sounded when he agreed that keeping me out was easier. I joined the call with Aunt Clara on the line too. My mother looked tired on the screen. My father sat beside my older brother in their living room, the same couch where Nathan had called me weeks earlier. Nathan started the call the way he always did, now calm and in charge. He ran through the schedule for my mother's recovery, who would drive her how the cabin rental would be split next year. He never once looked at me on the screen. When he finished, he asked if anyone had questions. I raised my hand like we were in a meeting. "I have one," I said. My voice was steady. "Why was I left off the original planning, and why am I being told now like it is already decided?" Nathan's expression tightened the way it had at the cabin. "Victoria, we have been over this. You make these conversations harder than they need to be. We are trying to keep things simple for Mom." I did not raise my voice. I simply opened the audio file on my phone and let it play through the speakers. The muffled but clear voices filled the room. My older brother saying I was too emotional. My father agreeing that it was easier without me. The silence on the call afterward felt heavier than any shouting match we had ever had. My mother covered her mouth with one hand. My father looked away from the camera. Nathan's face went through several expressions: in seconds surprise, then anger, then something colder. He leaned forward like he could physically stop the sound. That was taken out of context, he said, but his voice had lost its usual control. "You cannot just record private conversations and use them as weapons." Aunt Clara spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet but carried clearly. I recorded it because I was sitting in the kitchen hearing my own family talk about erasing one of us like it was a logistics problem. I stayed quiet for years because I did not want to make it worse. I am done staying quiet. Nathan's control cracked all at once. He stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly. His voice rose sharp and loud in a way I had never heard from him before. "You are all acting like I am the villain here," he shouted. "I have been the one holding everything together, while she turns every single thing into a crisis. If anyone is destroying this family, it is her constant need to be the center of attention. Dad, back me up on this." My father did not back him up. He sat very still, staring at the table. For the first time in my life, I saw him look uncertain instead of simply tired. My mother started to cry softly. The call had turned chaotic in a way none of us could steer anymore. Nathan kept talking, his words tumbling over each other, blaming me, blaming Aunt Clara, even blaming my mother for letting things get this far. Every accusation he threw at me landed back on him in the quiet that followed. He looked exactly like the person he had always claimed I was: emotional, out of control, making everything harder. I waited until he ran out of words. Then I spoke. "I am not coming to the cabin next year," I said. "I am not joining any more planning calls or group texts about family decisions. I will still check in on Mom when she wants me to, but I will not sit in rooms where I have already been decided out of the story. That is my boundary. It is not up for discussion." Nathan started to say something else, but my mother shook her head, once small and tired. He stopped. The call ended a few minutes later with almost nothing resolved except the one thing that mattered. I had said the words out loud. I had meant them. In the weeks that followed the family myth, my older brother had spent years building quietly collapsed. He had positioned himself as the steady, responsible one who could be trusted with the hard decisions. Once the recording existed and people had heard it, that image could not hold. My father stopped calling him for every small choice. Relatives who had always deferred to Nathan started asking my mother directly how she was doing instead of going through him. It was not a loud punishment. It was a slow, quiet loss of the influence he had worked so hard to secure. The irony was sharp. In trying to protect his place as the only one who could handle the family, he had shown everyone exactly why that place had never been his to claim alone. I did not get an apology from my father or my older brother. I did not expect one. What I got instead was space. The annual gatherings continued without me. The group texts went on without my name. At first, the silence felt like loss. Then it started to feel like room to breathe. I kept seeing Dr. Elena Vargas. I started new traditions that belonged only to me: solo hikes at sunrise dinners with friends who did not require me to shrink, long evenings on my back porch watching the light change on the red rocks. Aunt Clara came to Sedona for a weekend, and we cooked together without anyone else in the house. We did not talk about the recording or the call. We just existed in the same space without tension. The deep inner peace did not arrive all at once. It came in small moments. The first time I declined a family text without feeling guilty. The morning I woke up and realized I had not thought about the cropped photo in weeks. The afternoon I stood on a trail I loved and felt nothing but the wind and the sound of my own breathing. I had spent so long trying to force my way back into a story that had already edited me out. Letting go of that fight did not feel like defeat. It felt like finally telling the truth about what had been happening for years. My older brother still sends the occasional message, usually something short and practical about my mother. I reply when it is necessary and keep the rest of my life separate. My father has not reached out directly since the call. I do not chase him. The boundary I set that night on the screen has held because I stopped waiting for them to respect it and started enforcing it myself. The shared family routines we once had are gone. The annual cabin week, the group planning, the assumption that I would always be there, even when I was being erased. Those things belong to a version of our family that no longer exists. I miss some of it. I also know I cannot have the version I miss without also accepting the version where I am treated as optional. Real family never erases your existence to make someone else's life easier. Boundaries are not punishment. They are the line you draw when love has been replaced by management. I learned that the hard way sitting in my kitchen in Sedona with a forgotten envelope and a recording I never wanted to need. I would not trade what I have now for the version of me they needed me to stay. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If my story reminded you that you do not have to keep shrinking to fit inside someone else's comfort, then it did what I hoped it would. Comment strength if you felt this, and tell me in the comments what boundary you are learning to hold. Your story matters too.